This is Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerry-Ann Williams, and this is a podcast about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. Today, I'm joined by Deborah Jackson. Deb is a licensed clinical independent social worker who specializes in trauma and healthy coping mechanisms. Deb Jackson is the Associate Director of Training and Consultation at Justice Resource Institute and provides trainings regionally and nationally. She recently developed a training on implicit bias and microaggressions, and so I invited her to come on the podcast to talk a bit more about this. Welcome to the show, Deb.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
So, Deb, tell us a bit about yourself and why you enjoy teaching and consultation.
Thanks. So I think what I love the most is really being able to feel like I'm having a greater impact. When I was doing therapy primarily full-time, you really only impact maybe some of the clients you're working with, their families, those systems. But I think with training, I feel like there's a much broader impact. And some of the things that I love is when I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, like, you're the first Black professional trainer I've had, or you're the first Black professor I've had, or you're one of the first Black professors I've had. So being able to still impact in that way and show people that there's more that's out there. And so I still really feel connected to the work and to the mission, but I think I just get to do it at a more, not necessarily macro, I would say like a meso level. That's really nice.
Cool. And so bias. Okay. So listeners, I want you to think about what comes to your mind and heart when you hear the word bias. And now, listeners, I want you to imagine what it feels like to discover that you have a bias. Doesn't feel good, but we all have them. So, Deb, if you had to define the word bias, what would you say?
For me, when I think about bias, I think about its prejudice for or against like a people or a group or a thing. And it's really about feelings over facts, right? And so it's creating a situation where we're going more by our feelings in favor of or against something rather than the facts of a situation.
I see. And so then how do biases work? Like, what is implicit bias?
So I think one of the things that's really important is your original point, right? We all have bias because there's so much that our brain is processing on a regular basis that if we had to stop and think critically and examine every thought that we had, we would not be able to move, right? It would be entirely too much. It would be exhausting. And so bias is sort of our brain's shorthand way of being able to make choices quickly and do things. And so when we're talking about implicit bias, it's those biases that we're not aware of, right? And so I can know that I have a preference for this or I don't like that. But when we're talking about implicit bias, it's these hidden kind of undercover things that if you ask me, I might tell you my thoughts are actually contrary to what my biases show. And that is because we are inundated, right, with what our friends and family thinks, with what society has told us, with what we've learned in school, with what we see on the media. And so there are all of these messages that we've kind of internalized, sometimes without our awareness, and those impact the way that we are judging things.
Okay. And so, in your training, you have these different types of implicit biases. And, what kind of stood out to me, one was affect heuristic. We make decisions based on feelings, not facts. And that one kind of hit me because I was like, I'm kind of like that. I kind of sometimes make decisions based on feelings and not facts. So there's all these kind of biases, and they're not necessarily all racial kind of biases. There's one that's just the beauty bias. That's we think more positively of pretty people, and that affects a lot of us.
Right. It is. And if we stop and we think about it, it's true. We are biased towards pretty people. I think what we also want to think about, though, is what we think of as pretty or as beauty can be different in different situations. Right. And so I think about some cultures where people might have beauty standards where we're like, wait, what? That doesn't make sense to me. Why would they want to look like that? Why would they want to do that? Why would they want to have these things? And then it's like, no, because in that society or in that culture, that is what is considered beauty. And we all have this like calling towards things that we think of as beautiful, right? As pretty. We somehow imagine that it makes you smarter, more talented, more get like your opinion just has a little bit more weight than someone else's. And so it's really important for us to just kind of like recognize that, because we want to be aware of like, am I being kind of like hoodwinked into something because the right salesperson is giving me that message?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, in sales, they've caught on to that bias. A lot of salespeople, they're always really well dressed, very well groomed. And I'm sure they're kind of selected in certain ways.
I think about the stereotype, but it was actually really true around like the pharmaceutical sales reps. That pharmaceutical sales reps were very pretty people who went into that job. And it wasn't so much about like, could you sell the drugs as like, were you attractive enough that doctors were going to want to buy the drugs from you? Because that was what was more important than like your knowledge of the drugs, right? And so there are all sorts of ways that we see this showing up in life. And we can I think about particularly like in the workplace environment, there is sort of this push towards having more attractive people being the face of the company or the organization, because we know that it has a certain level of cachet.
Yeah. And it's so funny because as you mentioned that, it made me think a little bit about old school colorism, right? And how back in the day, within the Black community, lighter skin tone people were considered more beautiful than darker skin tone people. And even in countries like Jamaica, where I'm from, historically, they would have the lighter skinned ladies at the front of the bank working, and then have the darker skinned ladies in the back room doing the accounting or whatever, not being seen by the customers. And there was this kind of thought that was more not implicit. That was a very, very conscious bias, but it kind of made me think about how beauty standards can be influenced also then by racial prejudice.
Absolutely. And when you think through that lens of like colorism, right, it's not just light skin. Light skin gets you a lot, but do you have straighter hair? Is your nose thinner or your lips thinner, right? And then I think even more interestingly is when we see features that are maybe more typically Black leaning, and they're only attractive when they are on light or white skinned people, right? And so it's all of the girls that got BBLs, and it's like, oh, look at their figure, where Black women naturally, not all, but many already had lots of hips and thighs and derrieres. And it was unprofessional. It was sloppy. It was fat. It was all of these other things that when you put it on someone else, oh no, it's great. It's fabulous. It's wonderful. Why? Because we have that bias about who can look in certain ways and how that shows up and what does it mean about who they are as a person.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because I kind of started off thinking, well, beauty bias. Okay, that's very general. Yes. But when it comes to the Black community, you think about things like the Crown Act.
Yes.
What's considered beautiful, what's considered appropriate for, professional settings. And this person, oh, well, you have dreadlocks, or you have this, or you have that. And what's appropriate, what's, how a person looks, how they carry themselves draws. And people would say, well, I'm not racist, but I think that's unprofessional of you.
Exactly. Right. And so that link between like beauty and professionalism and what gets categorized as professional. Right. And so I think about all of the like, it's a messy hair bun trend, and it's fine depending on what the texture of your hair is. Right. Or the clothes that are considered professional. You can have two people who are wearing a button-down white shirt, but if one of them is more busty, if one of them is plus size, that shirt is not going to look the same on them. And so then it's like, oh, well, is that outfit really professional? It's a button-down shirt. What is not professional about it, right? But it's like, oh no, but it's very fitted. It's, and so there are all of these other things that come up, and that even today we have to have laws saying you can't discriminate on people based on how their hair grows out of their head, right? We have to have laws about that in 2024?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
We do.
Absolutely, which is just, it's baffling. But then when you think about all of the messages and all of the things and all of the bias that we have around what is professional, what is put together, what is neat, what is clean, you have all of these things. And again, when we think about this idea of it's feelings over fact, I think about in a very kind of like funny, but also interesting way, when there were all of these sort of like white celebrities or just white people in general talking about their shower routines and like how they didn't wash their entire bodies, right? They're not washing their legs or their feet when they get in the shower, or they're only like hitting certain areas and they're not washing everything. And yet Black people are very like conscious of washing because, one, like health and hygiene, and we know the link, but also there's already this like assumption or stigma around dirtiness, right? That the dark skin somehow is attracting more dirt. I don't know, but it's melanin, it's not dirt. But right, that there's, I don't know if you remember, there was like that old like soap commercials where it would be like the Black person was the unclean person, and then you washed with the ivory soap or something, and suddenly you were clean and you were white.
Oh, that I did not see that commercial. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there was, so there was a lot of, I think a couple of years ago, like Dove soap got into trouble because they had a commercial where they weren't specifically stating that, but there was a very real kind of dog whistle call to it. And there was so much pushback by the audience because it's like, wait a minute, what is it that you're saying? But also, right, that impression of who do we expect to be dirty and like what it means to not be clean, right? Is there the assumption of cleanliness, even if there is not the performance of cleanliness?
No, that is something that our listeners need to hear. Some people may not even be aware of like the historical underpinnings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's one more bias that I wanted to call attention to, and that was the affinity bias, which is we tend to think better of people that are similar to ourselves. And, it kind of reminded me of, back when there was, I think initially this kind of crisis with war in Ukraine, and there was a lot of movement of people trying to shift away from being in unsafe circumstances. And there was a discussion about migrants in general, and migrants coming from different countries and of different races and different backgrounds. And there was a statement that some European leader had made in kind of support of Ukrainian migrants. And they said something about like, oh, these people are just like us. These people are just like us. And it was kind of a statement that people globbed onto because they were looking at whether there was a difference in treatment with when migrants seemed to be similar in more similar to the leaders versus migrants coming from countries that were more different from those European leaders. And it was just interesting how this affinity bias, we tend to think better people that are similar to ourselves, kind of showed up in a way, just a slip in a comment. Oh, they're just like us, you know. So we do need to help them a bit more, or whatever the sentiment was at that time. It was just this little statement that kind of showed that we actually think of certain people differently.
Right. And so that was a real a demonstration of that implicit bias that person had, right? Because when we think of refugees, we are thinking of people from the global majority, right? We're thinking of Black and brown people, and they're coming in and like, they're not familiar with our ways. It's going to be hard for them to assimilate. And also, in some cases, this idea that like they don't need the same level of care and concern because like they'll just be grateful for anything, versus like, oh no, they're like us, like they're European. They're not other in the same way. And so, of course, we have to help them. Of course, we have to let them in. Of course, we're not going to give them the scraps that other people might have gotten because they are used to a higher quality of things. And so we've got to, try to match that standard. And I think about even when some of the videos were coming out around like the university students that were from African countries that were there and how much harder it was for them to get out of Ukraine than it was for other people to get out of, like the Ukrainians to get out of Ukraine. And again, they're all in the same situation. I went to bed, I woke up, and there's bombs, right? And so I'm trying to get to a place of safety, but you're treating me differently even in the evacuation, right? Because I'm more comfortable with the people that feel like me or that look like me, that seem like me, because it feels safe when I'm with my people versus the other.
Right. And so this idea, I think people sometimes, one of the ways that we think about this affinity bias is sometimes we don't realize how much we're othering people, because we feel like, well, we accept everybody, right? We love everybody, but we don't really, it's, I guess that we're blind to that sense of how much we other people that are different from us. So microaggressions. Is this just a small act of aggression? Is it being passive aggressive? What's a microaggression?
I love that question because so many people get stuck on the micro and think micro as small rather than micro as being between individuals or small groups. So when we're talking about microaggressions, it's not necessarily that they're tiny, right? First, I want to think about microaggressions oftentimes feel like the death by 1,000 paper cuts because it's the cumulative impact of things. And also what we want to think about is micro rather than macro, right? So we're not necessarily talking about the systemic forms of oppression where it's like I'm writing policy and procedure that is keeping you from having access to things. It's just that I, as an individual, I'm doing things that other you, that exclude you, that demean you, that kind of push you to the side. And so rather than it being macro, right, systems wide, it's micro in that it's between people, small groups, individuals, rather than the system wide approach. But no, passive aggressiveness can come into microaggressions, but it's not only, that's not the only level that they occur on.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the types of microaggression. So I was kind of looking at, again, the training that you developed, and you have micro-invalidation, micro-insult, micro-assault, and environmental. And micro-invalidation, the example is like, well, I don't see color. Tell us a little bit about why I don't see color, why that's a problematic kind of statement.
Yeah. So I think you and I are of the age where we kind of grew up where people like to talk about how they were colorblind. Mm-hmm. And so I don't see color was a really big thing that was kind of bandied about as like, no, I'm not prejudiced. I'm not racist. I don't even see color. Okay, let's talk about why that's problematic. One, you do see color. It's not like you're driving through red lights because you thought they were green because you couldn't tell the difference. You did. So what does that statement actually mean? The statement means that like, well, I'm not seeing you as different from me. I'm seeing you as the same as me. And I'm seeing you as the default, and the default is white. But I'm not white. And the default doesn't apply to me. And so when you're saying that you don't see or you don't recognize my reality, you are invalidating a huge part of my existence, right? And I think it's because people want to like act as though there is no difference. And there is a difference between something being different and something being better or worse.
Right.
We just want you to acknowledge the difference. And that doesn't have to mean that it's better or worse, because what is implicit for a lot of people in power is not just that I noticed the difference, it's that I view the difference as worse. I don't want you to not see the difference. I just don't want you to think the difference means worse.
And no, that's a great explanation, because I think that's, kind of how I think about it as well, is that differences are there and they're very clear and they can be acknowledged, but it becomes problematic that if you are saying that you don't see color or you don't see differences, then you're basically assuming that there's something bad about differences. Otherwise, why would you say that you didn't see them? So it's important to recognize differences, but to, as you mentioned, not assign them a comparison in terms of worse or better. And in that way, then you don't have to be colorblind. It's okay. It's okay to see color. It's okay to see color.
It's not that I don't want you to see my color. Like, hello, I am Black and I am proud to be Black. Yeah. I want you to not think that being Black has less value than being white or any other racial or ethnic category.
Mm-hmm. So now the other type of microaggression is a micro insult. Mm-hmm. When the example you gave is, "You are so well spoken." Why is that a problematic phrase?
So micro insults are the things that sound like compliments, and the person might even mean them as a compliment. But again, when we think about the link between microaggressions and bias, it shows your bias, right? When you're having these things. Because when you say to someone, "You are so well spoken," the underlying thought is, "I didn't expect you to be." And so now my question is, why didn't you expect me to be, right? It was like when Obama was president. That was one of the compliments that people gave to him all of the time. He was so well spoken. He was so articulate. What did you expect him to sound like? Right? This was a man who not only was president, but before that was a senator, before that had been to law school, like what did you expect him to sound like? And so I want us to always think about, who do we say these things to, right? The "you are so well spoken" statement never gets said about cis, het, non-disabled white men. You have never heard a cis, het, non-disabled white man be told, "You are so well spoken." Why? Because the assumption is that he would be. Your bias is showing.
So then the third type is the micro assault, which is, here's a good one. You said, "Since you don't have kids, you're going to work the holiday shift here at work."
And so when we get to this level, I think there's less room to kind of be like, maybe they didn't understand why this thing was concerning, right? Because if they didn't know, they should have known. And so when you think about the idea of like, well, you don't have kids, so you're going to work the holiday, one, that assumes that the only family that matters is kids. Two, who are we most likely to say this to? We're most likely to say this to women. And why? Because the assumption is that after a certain age, you are supposed to be a mother. So if you are not living up to this assumption that we have about who you are and what your identity should be, well, if you're not going to be doing the labor of raising kids, then clearly you can do the labor of working, and let those poor mothers go home and spend time with their children, as if you don't have family, friends, other obligations, in need of rest, right? Like any of those things, it's just centering down to this, you haven't met our expectations of what you should be, so now you get extra work. You have extra labor to do.
And as you mentioned, there's a gender bias in terms of, if a man does not have kids, is that statement said to the same frequency to him?
No, right. And it's when we think, especially like around some of the gender issues, right? We expect women to do the primary caretaking. And so if you're not and you have kids, well, then what does that mean? If a man says he doesn't want to have kids, okay, great. If a woman says she doesn't want to have kids, well, why? Well, have you thought about it? You never know love like the love of kids. Well, what does it even mean, right? And so there's all of these assumptions that come in and show up and how we're expecting people to be. But I also think about like the way that it shows up around marriage and families, right? We have statistics that show when men are married and have kids, their salary goes up. When women are married and have kids, their salary goes down. Why is that? What is the expectations? What's driving that for us, right? Or again, you have let's go with 37-year-old man and he's not married. He's a bachelor. You have a 37-year-old woman and she's not married. She's a spinster. Like get you anybody, get somebody on the ground, because what are you doing? You're withering on the vine, right? And so there is this expectation of what it means, right? It's the same way that I think about like, well, you should have kids because like, who's going to take care of you when you're old? Well, first, that's implying that the kids are going to do it. It's not a guarantee. Second, most good parents are not necessarily wanting to burden their children with caretaker responsibilities, but also it assumes that I can't have a life where I have, again, friends, other families. I don't know, maybe I've worked enough that I can afford a caretaker. It just kind of has all of these implications that are there that are examples of all of the implicit messages that we've gotten. And so that shapes the way that I think the world should work. And now when you are not meeting what my expectation of how the world should work, I am going to let you know that that is different. That is othering. I don't know if we appreciate that here.
And then the fourth one is environmental. So an example is having Confederate flags displayed.
Yeah, there was a really interesting story that I saw in the news, and I don't remember, forgive me, which southern state it was, but there was some southern state, I believe it was one of the Carolinas, that during the whole 2020 racial justice movement, they took the Confederate names off of schools, right? Because it was like, this is not helpful. This is not a part of the past that we want to glorify. We should do better. They recently voted to put the school's names back to the Confederate people. So now I want you to imagine what it is like that not only did I have to go to this school, like my family might have been going to the school for generations, and it's like Confederate General E. Lee, school. Okay, great. I've already had to deal with that. I think you've recognized how harmful this is. You're going to change the name. And 2, 3, 4 years later, you're like, haha, just joking. We're putting the name back up. We don't care about your feelings, right? And so what does that mean about how welcome I am in this place if you are glorifying people who were in favor of me not being seen as human? I don't really feel like I'm going to get the best education in this environment. I don't think that you have my best interest at heart.
So listeners, if you have any comments about these microaggressions, invalidation, insults, assaults, environmental, definitely, if you're watching this rather than listening to it, you can probably put a comment on this video. And so in this training, Deb, you actually have people go through a kind of experiential portion, and you have them kind of practice and identify why certain statements are indicative of bias. And some of the examples that you give are kind of related to work, and then some of them are kind of a little bit more general.
Yeah.
I want us to just kind of just discuss some of them, because some of them are things that people say all the time, right? So for example, oh, your name is really hard to pronounce. Can we just call you something else? You know what? I can't pronounce it, so I'm just going to call you a nickname. Why is that a microaggression?
Because I think about the level, right, of the like, I will not take the time to learn your name. And yet, there are all sorts of like literature. I'm going to learn Dostoevsky, but I'm not going to learn, how to say your name. And I think even more, what was interesting to me, and this was a revelation I've had through the work that I, have been doing, when I first started at JRI, I've been there almost 19 years. My name is Deborah. I came in and they named me Deb. That was not a nickname that I had had in any other space. I'd had other nicknames, depending on where you knew me from. I had other nicknames, but that was not one that I had ever had. I came in and it was on the door. It was on the answering machine. It was how they introduced me to clients. And I am there in all of my 25-year-old second real job out of grad school self. I'm not going to tell them that they need to like change my name on the answering machine or change my name on the door. And so I just went with it. And I remember telling this story to some colleagues years later, and they were like, oh my gosh, do you want us to like call you by your name? And I was like, no, it's fine. Like I've been calling myself Deb now for all of these years. But I think back, if I had the awareness and the self-assuredness that I have now, then I would have absolutely told them, no, my name is Deborah. It's not Deb, right? Why did you think that it was? Why did you think that it would be okay to, because again, no one called me that. It's not like I said that was my name. It wasn't like on my resume. I didn't come in for the interview and say any of this. You all just decided that that was what you were going to call me, and I went with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think about all of the times where those are the things that happen. And I want to say in full transparency, my supervisor at the time, I love her. I love her to this day. She was a mentor to me. She's a fabulous person. She didn't recognize the microaggression in that situation. And I was too timid to call it out. And so there are these situations that come up where people, because microaggressions are not always, again, known, right? They're the things that people are doing where they are blatantly trying to let you know you do not belong here. But then there are the implicit biases that come out. They're the ways that we've been socialized to think. And so there is this assumption that some people are not worthy of you taking the time to say their full name, their whole name, or their name correctly, right? And I think about the historical legacy of where Black people would name their kids things like princess, queen, king, marquise. Why? Because they would get called boy. Mm-hmm. Or they would be called by their first name, but they had to refer to people as Mr. or Mrs. or Sir or Ma'am, even if they were younger than them. So if you're going to disrespect me by calling me by my first name, I'm going to make my first name Princess. You're going to call me Princess every time you have to talk to me, right? Mm-hmm. There's a reason why that was done. It was a pushback against the microaggressions that people were experiencing.
No, I thank you for sharing that historical context as well, because I think people sometimes don't understand where some of it is coming from. And that's, I think, a helpful kind of example. You know, and I think about the name pronunciation thing, I remember hearing a story and one of these, kind of news, kind of NPR-like kind of programs. And it was a woman who was from China. And she's told a story about how she moved to the US, she felt pressured to have, like an English name. Mm. And her journey of how, as she got older, she went back to her own Chinese name and said, you're just going to have to learn how to pronounce my name. And, to not feel the burden of saying, oh, I have to change to some other name. And that was her story. But it kind of just made me think about that idea of, if my name is hard to pronounce, like, do I make it easy for other people and say this or that? Or, is it, do I do that out of pressure? Or does someone else, because a microaggression is when someone else just decides, yes, I'm not going to call you that. You're going to have to deal with a nickname because I'm not even going to try.
Right. And so you're not even going to attempt it. How many things did we see the first time written down and we're like, ooh, I don't know. And you ask people and some of us will do the work of like, repeat that for me. Did I say it right? No, I didn't. Okay. Tell me again. Right. Like, because I believe that you are worth the effort of being able to say it correctly. And I think about for a lot of us, or for a lot of people where there is that reclaiming, I went with it because of whatever reason, right? Pressure, trying to get along, trying to assimilate, trying to not cause waves, wanting a job, right? There's so many reasons why people might not have called out, hey, that is why I let you call me these things. And now being really clear about, nope, this is my name and this is what I want you to call me. And I think about how many times there is pushback against people just saying, this is my name and so this is what you should call me. There's a writer that I love on, I found her on Instagram. I've done some work with her. Her name is Ebony Janice, and she starts most of her videos saying, my name is Ebony Janice, so you should call me Ebony Janice. I go by Ebony Janice, right? Why is she telling you her name multiple times? Because how many people, when she said, my name is Ebony Janice, decided to call her Ebony or Eb or Janice or some variation of it. And she's making it very clear, you do not have the privilege, you do not have the relationship, you do not have the right to call me anything but what I'm telling you to call me. And I'm going to stand on business about that. And how much there can be pushback, right? Because like, wait, is it that big of a deal? And I always want to go, well, if it's not that big of a deal, why can't you do it? I always love when there's the like, you're making such a big deal out of something. Well, if it's not that big of a deal, why can't you do what I'm asking you to do? Because you're telling me it's not a big enough deal, I should let it go. Why is it not a big enough deal for you to let it go?
Wow. Now, the second one, your hair is so cool. Can I touch it? Why is that a problematic statement, especially in the Black community? Tell us, Deb.
I think about all of the info that has come out over the years of just no, right? Just don't do this, because you pet dogs, you don't pet people, right? And I have seen people with very cool hair, different colors, shaved in designs, right? Like really amazing hairstyles from a whole racial group of people, right? From a variety of folks. My only thing has been, your hair is amazing. Your hair is cute. Maybe I'm going to ask you some questions about what products you put into it. But I have never been like, let me pet you like I do my cats and my dog, because that's weird, right? And I think about how many times, one, that happens to people and they don't even ask. Their hands are like already in your hair before they're even asking, right? Or when you kind of go like, no, there's all of this pushback, as if you don't have bodily autonomy, as if you don't have agency, as if I can't say, no, you cannot physically touch me without my permission. And I really question, like, who else do we do this with? Who else do we feel I have the right to touch you, even if you do not want to be touched? This only happens when people are marginalized.
Yeah. Wow. Now, there is one more, and it is, you have to use your personal money to buy hygiene products if you don't like what we have. Explain a little bit more about that. And I'll also, go ahead and explain that one.
Yeah. So first prefacing, this training is obviously done for people who are in the mental health field, right? And so these can be people who are running residential programs, doing outpatient work. I've done it for DCF workers, right? So there's a lot of people there, but I'm going to speak specifically to the residential portion, either that being a residential program or some sort of foster care, aggregate care situation, right? Outside of the home. And so one of the basic premises when you are in and out of home placement is that they are supposed to be seeing to your basic needs, right? And so they're going to have hygiene products that they provide for you. They're going to have bedding that they provide for you. They're going to have food that they provide for you. They're going to have all of these basic needs that they are supposed to meet in order to have you. Now, when we think, let's talk specifically around the residential treatment side of things. One is that we know there is a big discrepancy between who gets put into the system, right? We know that there is an overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? And whether that is in the sort of juvenile justice detention side of things or the residential treatment side of things, there is going to be this overrepresentation. So you know that there are going to be people that are there. I get it. It's a program. You have a limited budget. You are trying to maximize what you can use your funds for. And so when you are providing hygiene products, you are going to try and choose something that is cheaper, right? But we also know, because of all of the strategic oppression that exists in the world, hygiene products for BIPOC folks tend to be more expensive, right? You're not going to be able to buy them anywhere. You can't just assume every Walgreens is going to have it. Every Target is going to have it, right? And so sometimes I've been in programs, or I've gone to programs to do this work, where they've said things like, yeah, well, we provide like lotion, deodorant, shampoo, conditioner, but the kids don't like it. Well, is it that they don't like it, or is it that it's not appropriate for them? And it's like, well, if they don't like what we have, like, they can use their money to buy more. So you're expecting them to provide something that the expectation from the state is that you will provide. And that is an additional cost that you are now putting on those children, because their money can no longer get used for fun things or reward things. Their money now has to go to basic supplies, because there's also going to be, again, especially when we're talking about hygiene, so much pushback if I'm not clean, if I'm not smelling fresh and new, right? And so when we think about the products that are necessary, if you aren't providing them and you don't know the frequency that they need to be used at or what works, and that it's not necessarily a universal thing, right? Like, it's not like, okay, well, I'm just going to go buy Carol Dorder's products and that's going to work for everybody. Nope, there's some folks that's not going to be the right product for too, right? So are we asking, are we doing that work? Like, lotion is not lotion for everybody. Listen, I'm going to need you to put some butter in my lotion. A shea butter, a cocoa butter, an African butter, somebody's butter needs to be in my lotion for me to be properly moisturized. You can't buy me Suave lotion and think that that is going to do anything for my skin. So I'm sorry, I know it costs a little bit more. I'm going to need you to buy the product that works for me. And why would you think that it's optional? Because you're viewing it as a luxury, right? You're just being picky. You just want this thing that costs more, is harder to get, harder to find, all of these things, rather than, no, this is the necessity for you. Your baseline is not the same. And so different, but let's not look at it as better or worse. It's just different.
But also kind of, this as an amazing explanation. And it just kind of makes me think about, again, this idea of what's considered optional, this sense of like, what's the default?
Yeah.
And if you're not a part of the default, then now it is something that we feel we don't have to provide.
Absolutely.
Like, who represents the default? And the default kind of what percentage of, what's the demographic of kids coming into programs that are using these products, And
I think about how much of the administration level is white, right? And they are the people who usually have the decisions around what you're purchasing. But then when we think about how many of the line staff tend to be BIPOC folks, are you asking them? And do they feel comfortable enough to be able to tell you, this ain't it. This is not gonna work, right? I think about the programs where I've gone to and done some consulting where there might have been this expectation of like, well, you have to wash your hair every day. No, No, right? Or I think about even, I've talked a lot about you're providing bedding, right? So you provide sheets and pillowcases and that is a requirement, right? Is it satin? Is it satin pillowcase? Satin bonnet, satin headscarf, something. And do you just give it to me? Or do I have to ask for it? And if I have to ask for it, do you have it readily available or do I have to wait? What am I doing in the waiting? Am I expected to pay for it? Because that's not standard. All of these are issues that we don't necessarily consider when we're thinking about the level of care.
Mm. No, it's amazing because I think it's so easy to miss. It's easy to miss because, in general, facilities tend to have this kind of standard approach. And if you don't fit the box, then now you've got to figure out what you're going to do on your own. And so this discussion about what should a facility then pay for reasonably, given what they've agreed to provide for what each person needs, even if that person has a different need based on their cultural heritage, their racial heritage.
Yeah, because the agreement wasn't that you were just going to provide like Suave lotion. The agreement was that you were going to provide hygiene products. So are you providing the hygiene products that work for everyone?
Right.
Or do we only prioritize some?
Exactly. Is this hygiene products that are only working for some people and others, either have to buy it on their own or have to conform? They have to conform.
Yeah.
So let's say, listeners are kind of listening to this today and they have said some of the things we talked about. They've maybe done some of the things we talked about. They didn't realize that it made others feel insulted. They didn't realize it was a microaggression. How can they kind of learn how to recognize biases and improve? What are some strategies that you tend to teach people for what to do in these situations?
Yeah, that's a great question because I want to go back to our original premise, right? We all have biases. Most, if not all of us, have done a microaggression at one point or another, right? The first thing that we want to be able to do is recognize. And then I think about you are going to get better at understanding when you are surrounding yourself with people, with thoughts, with ideas that are different than the ones that you have been socialized or normed into, right? And so I think about, I'm someone who is a very big believer in social media and the power of social media to like get messages and bring other things to people. And so there is a Black woman who is, her name is Imani. She's on TikTok as Crutches and Spice, and she does a lot around education around disability work and the importance of disability. And I recognized when I started following her account how much bias I had around ability. Why? Because I have ability privilege. And so there were so many things that I did not think about. Why? Because I did not have to think about. And so you don't think about the ways that out of your privilege, you are saying and doing things that are making people feel othered, making people feel separate, making people feel excluded. And for me, it genuinely was like, I just didn't know any better. But now that I am getting this information and making a concerted effort, it absolutely changes the way that I show up in spaces. And I want to fully say, I still have work to do, right? This is not like, I've listened to this person, I've read these books, I've looked at these articles, I've listened to these podcasts, and now I'm completely better. No, this is an ongoing practice that we have to work out. And so the first thing I want us to do is notice when there is the discomfort. Because a lot of times we want to push it aside and we want to justify, right? And so I did this thing that I know was a microaggression, or you've now told me, right? I didn't know, but you're like, hey, Deb, just so you know, the thing you just said, that was a microaggression. I immediately want to go into, that wasn't my intention. That wasn't my intention. And let me show you how good of a person I am. Let me tell you all of the good things that I do so that you don't judge me badly, right? Because I don't want to think of myself as a person who's going around creating microaggressions all the time. It doesn't fit with what I believe about myself or who I want to be as a person. Rather than being able to sit in the discomfort and being like, oh, let me recognize it if I didn't recognize it, and then examine what's behind that thought. And then what is the unlearning that I need to do? Because I've learned some things implicitly. I have these biases. I have these things that have shaped how I'm experiencing the world that I now recognize I need to unlearn because they're harmful. So what is the work that I'm doing to unlearn? And then what is the practice? Because I think a lot of times what people get stuck in is the research portion. I've read these books. I've listened to these TED Talks. I've talked to these people, and then there's no practice. Mm-hmm. You've got to put things into practice. So what have you done with all of the knowledge that you've accumulated? How are you actively working to make things better with the knowledge that you now have? Or is it just I digested it, I'm going to be better, right? And so this is active work. And this is why when people talk about it's not enough to just not be something. We have to be anti something, right? So we have to be anti-racist. We have to be anti-sexist. We have to be anti-homophobic, because if I just want to live in neutrality is often causes harm to the marginalized and the disenfranchised and the oppression and those who are oppressed. Sorry. So it's not enough to just be like, I don't do it, but other people might. No, what am I doing to actively change the system?
No, I like that idea of you have to practice. You have to actually do it. It can't just be in theory, because those implicit biases you'll still be blind to them.
You will still be blind to them, and you will still be causing harm.
And I think that's the hard part, is that if you don't deal with it, you will still cause harm.
Yeah. And so I think, again, I just want to highlight so much. You're going to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. We all do. Nobody is perfect. This is a journey, and some of us are further along the journey than others are. But can you commit to the journey? And I think especially, I will say this, we all have privilege in different areas. And so sometimes it is really easy for us to be able to see the way that people's biases are working against us, where people are performing microaggressions against us. Can you recognize the times where you have bias against someone or a group when you are performing microaggressions, and then commit to the practice of unlearning and being different?
Yeah. I remember when I asked someone if I could touch their hair, I was kind of like, well, oh, your hair's so cool. Can I touch? And the way that she looked at me, I was kind of like, okay, I'll never ask that again.
Right, because sometimes we don't know. We didn't know that when I was sharing this with my supervisor, she was like, Deb, I really want to talk to you about some of these, because I think I've said some of these things and I didn't understand why it was a problem. Right. And as we worked through and talked through, she was able to see. And she was like, well, I've said things about your hair. And I'm like, sweetheart, listen, right now, you see the curls are curling. Next Friday, I'm going to the braid shop. I'm going to have braids, and they're going to be multicolored, because I'm going to do that. The next time, I'm going to get out and I'm going to have to get these roots touched up, because I want you to be like, your hair is hairy. Your hair is beautiful. I have questions. That's fine. Can I touch? No. Or when you say things like I almost didn't recognize you because your hair is different. Really? Because I recognized you perfectly well when you dyed your hair blonde and put in 20-inch weave. I knew exactly who you were. When you rocked your wig, I still recognized you. So you can just say it looks nice. It looks cool. It looks different. I have done that to people. I have never given somebody a compliment on their hair. I was like, your hair is awesome. I love the purple. I think it's, and then been like, ugh. Who doesn't love compliments? Listen, they didn't do that just to for nobody to notice. There's a difference between appreciation and othering, right? It's literally just that sense of like, I feel like I can come into your space and touch you. Where is that a thing? Where else do we feel free to do that?
So kind of thinking about what is it that made that person feel like they had a right to do that. So as we kind of wrap up, I always like to invite guests on my show to share kind of their top 5 tips, just general tips for boosting mental wellness overall. For our listeners to maybe try some new things or just think about their general mental health. What are some of your top things that you do to take care of your mental wellness?
Yeah. So I'm always going to obviously be a big proponent of therapy. I'm a trained therapist. I have a therapist. Therapy is great. I also know that therapy can be inaccessible to people for a lot of reasons. And so are there other spaces where you can get that time and that space to really focus on what your mental health, right? What your mental wellness looks like, whether that be podcasts like this, whether that be articles, whether that be looking at social media accounts of people, but really sort of prioritizing for yourself, what do I need to do to feel like I am in a good space mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, all of those things. So I'm going to say definitely therapy is something I'm a big proponent of. Let's talk about the physical. Drink water. If it is not enough apparent, it is hot in my house. Apparently the fans do not want to kick in, so I've been sweating this entire time. When I tell you I'm about to go drink a whole bottle of water when this is over, like stay hydrated out on these streets. So making sure, right, healthy eating can be a bit much for people. It can feel overwhelming. What is health? There's so much stigma and bias around what is healthy. So can we just focus on drinking our water, right? And staying hydrated. So I would say is 2. 3, find hobbies and interests. I think sometimes we have gotten sucked into this late stage capitalist work to live world. And like, sometimes you just need hobbies and interests, and not hobbies and interests that you were trying to turn into a side business, right? Like, I think so many of us have just bought into the hustle and the grind culture. And if that works for you, then do that. I'm not downing that, but also like, read a book just because you want to read a book. Garden just because you enjoy gardening, right? Like paint your pictures, even if you're not a great painter, but because it relaxes you and it allows you to explore your creativity. Have hobbies, have interests. My 4th is going to be community. I think especially after the pandemic, we saw how hard it was for people to maintain community. And there have been some great tools that have come out, but there's also remained, I think, a real distance for folks. And there is just something about being able to be with your people, to feel seen and loved and heard and valued, that is chef's kiss unbelievable. And so have community, whatever that looks like for you. And then the last thing that I will say is really thinking about your environment and what can you do to make it a place that feels safe and secure, because so much of the time out in the world, we are in situations, or we might come across situations that make us feel unsafe, where we have to put on a mask, where we have to perform in some way. And so I really want for people to feel like their home is their sanctuary as much as possible, and that place where you can just authentically, genuinely be yourself and relax and be at peace.
Oh, those are wonderful. I think all of them are, things that we need to think about and really prioritize to boost our mental wellness. And so thanks for coming on the show today, Deb.
Thank you so much for having me.
So guys, Deb has a small private practice. You can find her at jacksoncounselingri.com. That's jacksoncounselingri.com. And so you can check out her website and, connect with her there. And thank you to all my listeners that have been listening today. Remember this week to be mindful, be introspective, be kind, and be culturally humble. Take care and have a great week. Bye.